Has anyone ever been to a wedding where someone actually objected, and if so, how did that go? I feel like about half of weddings these days don't have that part, and not because of feared objections, just because it is outdated and weird. Premarital sex is a thing. Divorce is a thing. Weddings cost like over $10,000. If you know reasons to stop a marriage outside of movies, you need to intervene at the engagement or earlier, not during the ceremony. That said, one of my wife's college roommates canceled a wedding like a day or 2 days beforehand right after graduating college, after being in a long-distance relationship with some guy for a year or so. Her family was quite well off and she was dating a guy who lavished gifts and expensive dates on her whenever they were together, said he ran his own company, just bought a them fancy house, etc. It turns out he was just super in debt, working a near minimum wage job and maxing out credit cards taken out fraudulently. He had a fake web page with other employees for his company that he set up for the sole purpose of keeping up the front. The house was only bought from grossly lying about income, pre-2007 housing crisis, on the mortgage application, and he was drowning in debt. The almost bride's father got bad vibes about the guy. A few things didn't add up, like he had this fancy house but couldn't afford any furniture, and he hired a place who quickly uncovered the deception. And she didn't break up cause he wasn't rich. She broke up because he spent tons of effort to lie about everything and was completely conning her and just trying to get her roped into joint ownership of his debt via marriage that he expected the family to pay off. My auntie's fiance was already married. Lady stood up waving marriage cert, so wedding didn't go ahead. The reception was on a long boat, so we still went to that. The fiance went back to home country to sort it out and never came back. I worked a wedding where one of the moms objected, but I think the groom knew that the parent was going to say something, so they just responded with, "Oh, sit down. Parent's name, we knew you didn't like this a year ago and clearly we're not going to change our minds today." The wedding continued like nothing happened, but the mom was low-key shunned and people avoided her at the reception. Not a wedding, but at a funeral someone objected the death. At my uncle's funeral, his ex-wife and a local church cult leader tried to raise him from the dead. We were all sitting there like normal people at a normal funeral, and she walks up to the casket and starts yelling, "James Lester, raise up." I didn't know she was there or I would have prepared myself for shenanigans. Also, I didn't know my uncle's middle name was Lester, so please imagine the confusion. So she and the cult leader are literally yelling at my uncle's body. Not surprisingly, my uncle refused to resurrect himself. They were escorted out. I've actually never told this story because it makes my family look insane. This was in America, and the wedding was in a Buddhist temple. Parents of the groom stood up and objected because they didn't believe the bride was of the same class. They spoke in another language, so most of the English-speaking guests didn't know they were objecting. My husband was the best man and those closest to the couple knew this might happen. The Buddhist priest said he would handle it if the parents tried anything. After the parents spoke for a while, the priest said to the groom, "You've heard what your parents had to say, what do you want to do?" The groom replied, "I want to marry my bride." So the priest asked the parents to leave. At this point the rest of the guests are cluing in that this was not a nice part of the ceremony, and that the parents were actually objecting. So, as the parents walked out, some of the guests were berating them, saying things like, "You should be ashamed of yourself," and "How could you do that?" And even though the groom was not happy with his parents, that was very hard for him to hear. That was 30 years ago. The couple is still married. They have 2 beautiful, successful children. After the groom's mom passed away, the groom's father came around and was involved in their lives until he died. A woman, in her 20s at the time, objected to her mom marrying my uncle. So she started yelling, "Mom, don't marry him." During the ceremony proceeded and some family on the mom's side lead the daughter away to quit interrupting. I don't blame her. My uncle was a lying, lazy bastard. The marriage didn't last. I went to a wedding where the best man was replaced a week before because he banged the bride. But the wedding still went ahead, just with a different best man. They are divorced now. This is only tangentially related, but I had a friend I knew for like 3 months who told me at the wedding I was the maid of honor. Like the wedding was starting, I was pushed to the front. I was chosen over her own sisters. The whole wedding was that kind of chaos. It was the best wedding I've ever been to. I had to ask my original bridesmaids if they were okay with my older friends becoming my bridesmaids. They told me a day before the wedding they weren't coming. Why I wanted to change my bridesmaids. They both acted distant since a few months before the wedding, but a week before the wedding I had my bachelorette, and the original bridesmaids didn't even want to stay for dinner because they had work the next day. My other friends, who usually never gossip about others, told me this was a bit unusual, and it was really the least they could do for me. My friend from years ago had to drive 3 hours home and get up at 6 a.m. and she was so happy to celebrate me and with me. I also organized and paid for my own bachelorette, because I didn't want to feel like a burden for others, but how these so-called friends let me down during that stressful period is something I would never forget. So yes, sometimes there are emergency bridesmaids needed, and you were at the right place at the right time for her. I assume she was very grateful and relieved to have you there. And be there for her. For multiple reasons too. My wife was promoted to bridesmaid at about 6:30 a.m. on the day of a friend's wedding because her very pregnant Mo had a scare and ended up having to go to the hospital. It happens. My own brothers are evidence of this. Brother 1 was getting married. The night before, brother 2 gets wasted and decides to drive. He gets pulled over and thrown in jail at like 4 a.m. Brother 1 won't bail him out because he needs the money for the honeymoon. He does manage to talk the cops into letting him get brother 2's tux out of the impounded car so another one of his friends can stand in his place for the wedding. Not quite the question is asked, but too funny to not share. Priest. Any objections? Father of the bride lets out the hardest, loudest, most complex sounding sneeze I've ever heard in my life, completely with involuntarily saying ACH000000. Mother of the bride hammered on champagne. For fuck's sake, Jerry. It took a good 5 minutes for everyone to regain their composure. I was at a small ceremony indoors, maybe 30 people tops listening. When the minister asked for any objections, a picture of the bride's dead grandmother that was hanging on the wall fell to the ground with a loud thump. We looked at each other, but the minister finished anyway. Divorced within a year. I had a friend who was a minister, and the subject came up if he asked the question during ceremonies he officiated. He laughed and said no way. He basically tells the couple not to include it because it only invites a moment of anxiety at best, misery at worst. His best story, and one of the reasons he stopped including the question, was a couple where the lead up to the wedding the couple was obviously in love. The bride-to-be was very smiley and happy. Day of the wedding she's stone-faced. He knows something is up because he's never seen her like this and he asks if she is okay. I'm fine. Right before the service he asks again. I'm fine. He gets to the question, does anyone object to this union? The bride reaches over, grabs the maid of honor, shoves her into the bride's spot and says, "You're screwing him, you marry him." And then stormed out of the church. Slightly different circumstances, but I know a guy that was the videographer at a wedding where the groom was the one that objected to the wedding at that point. When the priest asked if anyone objected, the groom broke down crying and said that he couldn't go through with the wedding. Apparently he had gotten a stripper pregnant, and felt like he had to marry the stripper instead of the bride. He got pulled into a side room by the officiant, his father, and the father of the bride while everyone else, including the bride, stood around awkwardly. A few minutes later the father of the bride came out and told everyone that the ceremony was over and the wedding was off, but that everyone was welcome to go to the reception and enjoy the food. My friend didn't stick around for the reception. I have no idea how it all turned out. But apparently the bride was understandably not taking it well. At his rehearsal dinner, a coworker's mother toast included that his soon-to-be wife was a damn dirty whore who wasn't good enough for her son. Folks not happy. Video ended so didn't see the whole thing. At wedding which I attended, his mom started to say something at the "speak now" part but was silenced by her daughter. Mom left and didn't see the rest of the ceremony. Everything about that poor guy was drama. My friend's Mill made a speech at the wedding which included, "Now y'all can go have sex all night, you ain't gotta wait no more. You ain't gotta sweet talk her no more. Baby boy, you can just take her up whenever you like. in almost the most jealous tone I have ever heard. It was unsettlingly bizarre. She didn't object to the marriage, but we all objected to her. Also, before anyone assumes she was drunk, it was a dry wedding. I'm aware that dry weddings and drinking aren't mutually exclusive. The woman was not drunk. She's just a gross person. I don't know if it's a UK thing or even just a one specific church thing, but I was told by the priest in a rehearsal that if someone objects, even as a joke, the priest is required to pause the ceremony and talk to the objector alone to discuss their concerns and decide if they have a valid objection. Like it's not a fun jokey moment, it's a real legal part of the ceremony. He also said it used to be custom that if you raised an invalid objection you then had to pay for the wedding. A relative visited one ceremony where it was asked if anyone objects, and the groom decided it's a good time for a joke and said, "I do." The lady who was going to marry the couple just turned and left. They had to go through all the paperwork again and change the date. Got married, divorced in like 3 years if I remember correctly. Oldie but a goodie, this happened back in the 70s, this was shared to by the guy who married my parents. It went something like this. Does anyone object to this union? I do. That's my husband. So they paused the wedding. The bride, groom and the woman objecting went into a small room. The woman who objected provided documentation showing the groom was still legally her husband. Apparently the couple had started divorce proceedings some time earlier but never finished. The wedding was cancelled and everyone sent home. A friend of mine has a band that plays lots of weddings and other parties. They were hired for a birthday party that turned out to be a surprise wedding. The guy surprised his GF with a proposal and wanted to have a wedding ceremony then and there. She said no and left. Kind of. My uncle was getting married. Small, just a handful of family and a minister. I was videotaping. My grandmother was not into it at all. With each line spoken by the minister, she had a cutting, sarcastic response. I could not believe it. It was so unlike her. When that part came up, she said, "I object. But does it really matter? They are going to do it anyway." The minister just ignored her and proceeded, business as usual. They were divorced within a year. Wish I had a copy. The vicar who married us said to everyone at the beginning, as part of the introduction, not to say anything as a joke unless they actually had a reason, as legally she would have to stop the ceremony and investigate the claim. I worried that would tempt some joker even more, but we got through the silence with only a couple of muffled giggles. Yes, at my cousin's, the bride's ex showed up, and when he stood up to object my uncles grabbed him and bum rushed him out of the church and gave him a tune-up in the parking lot. Catholic wedding, of course. Edit. Holy shit, Christian rituals around the world are different than the ones I've seen. WTF, impossible. Okay. This will sound absolutely stupid, but when I was a kid, my deeply religious aunt had her wedding at a local church. During the objecting part, lightning struck very near the church. I remember to this day how the following thunder was so loud that the fancy windows of the church started rattling. Well, the timing of the strike was very unfortunate for my uncle because my aunt took this as a sign of a god objecting to her marriage and called the wedding off on the spot. Needless to say, they married on the same day a year later, and this time without objection from a god. They are still married to this day. The mom of one of the bridesmaids got up and yelled, "Yeah, I object. You fucking stole him from her," while pointing at the bride. I've known the groom for a long time and by proxy the bride. I am still very good friends with them. I have never seen her more infuriated than at that moment. The bridesmaid got up from her chair and was like, "I'm so sorry. Let me get her out of here." The bridesmaid and the bride's stepfather escorted the woman out of the wedding, and it continued. Not exactly an objection, but the wedding was on a boat, no one could leave, and the groom was Jewish and marrying a Mexican Catholic woman. The groom neglected to tell his family it was a full Catholic wedding, and the groom's family stood up and pitched a fit when they realized the groom was going to take communion. The uncle who sponsored his bar mitzvah stood up and announced that the groom was a disgrace to the family and walked downstairs. The reception was a shit show. I was at one. Didn't know what happened as I was in the back. The bride runs out to the limo, her family after her. I said to the person next to me, cold feet. She's like, oh no, I thought this might happen. Her ex is here. We went outside. He'd apparently come into a lot of money. He came to the side door front of the church, said he objected because he's rich and wants her back. She paused too long for the groom's liking. He said, fuck you both. She ran. Last I saw they were at the limo with her. She was crying. Have no idea how it ended, but there was no wedding. We went to the reception, no bridal party. We ate, drank, danced and left. One of my cousins is married to literally one of the kindest and coolest dudes I have ever met. Before the wedding, her little sister was saying how she's marrying my best friend. At the wedding, when the priest dude asks if anyone objects, the room is dead quiet and all you hear is a little girlish whisper, I do. It was honestly really adorable and we all laughed, and my cousin's husband and her little sister are still best friends. I was not at the wedding, but know of a case where there was an objection and the circumstances were quite exceptional. When I was a detective with the Child Protection and Sexual Offenses Unit, we dealt with a case involving a 14-year-old girl who had been raped by a known adult male. The first disclosure of the rape was made by her at his wedding ceremony, which she attended uninvited. When the pastor asked if there were objections, she rose and said yes, she had an objection. The groom had raped her a week before. The pastor stopped proceedings and took the child to an adjacent office, where she repeated the allegation and gave more information. Shockingly, the bride was still willing to go through with the ceremony, which was concluded while the girl waited in the office. Afterwards, the pastor took her to the local police station, Belleville South in Cape Town, South Africa, where a case was opened and the matter assigned to my unit for investigation. We carried out the arrest at the V&A waterfront, Cape Town the next evening, Sunday, where the groom and his friends were partying it up. The bride, of course, was left home alone, one day after the wedding. I was blown away by the courage it took for the girl to attend the wedding ceremony alone, surrounded by the friends and family of the perpetrator, and to make the disclosure to his face in the way she did. For those wondering how she knew so much about him and when he would be getting married, he lived in close proximity to the girl's family in Belleville South, and the two families knew each other. He had siblings who attended school with her.